The hospital tent smelled of carbolic acid and death. Nurse Margaret Sullivan had learned to breathe through her mouth during her 3rd week in Normandy. But even that couldn't keep the smell from settling into her hair, her skin, her dreams. It was July 1944, and the field hospital 3 miles behind Omaha Beach had become a machinery of survival, sorting the living from the dying, the salvageable from the lost. She moved between the cots with practiced efficiency, her white apron stained brown with old blood. The sounds were always the same: groaning, weeping, the occasional scream when the morphine ran out. But one sound was different that morning. A whisper. So soft she almost missed it beneath the chorus of suffering. "Please," Margaret stopped. The voice came from the corner cot, the one she'd been avoiding. Bed 47. The boy, because that's what he was, really. Just a boy despite the uniform, had arrived 3 days ago with shrapnel wounds across his chest and abdomen. Dr. Patterson had looked at his chart, looked at Margaret, and shaken his head. Internal bleeding they couldn't stop. Infection spreading faster than the sulfa drugs could fight it. "Maybe 2 days, Patterson had said. "Maybe 3 if he's strong." This was day 3. Margaret approached the cot slowly. The soldier's eyes were open, fever-bright and desperately young. His name was James Edward Morrison, age 19, from a small town in Iowa called Cedar Rapids. She'd read his tags. She always read their tags. "I'm here," she said, kneeling beside him. The ground was damp beneath her knees. It had rained during the night, and the tent leaked. Everything here leaked. Hope, time, life. James's hand moved slightly, fingers trembling. Margaret understood immediately. She'd seen this before, too many times. The need for connection in those final moments. The animal instinct against dying alone. She took his hand in both of hers. His skin was burning hot. "My mother," he whispered. His voice was thick, drowning. His lungs were filling. Tell her I wasn't scared." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. It happened sometimes, despite her training, despite the walls she'd built. She was 26 years old, 5 years older than this dying boy, and she'd held 43 hands before his. She'd counted. She kept counting because the numbers made it real, made it matter, made it mean something that she'd been there when no one else could be. "I'll tell her," Margaret said. "I promise." James's breathing changed. She knew that sound. Minutes now, not hours. His eyes found hers, and in them she saw terror and gratitude mixing into something she had no name for. His grip tightened. "Don't let go," he said. "I won't." And she didn't. Not when Dr. Patterson walked past with another urgent case. Not when the tent filled with new wounded from a skirmish near St. Lo. Not when her legs went numb from kneeling and her back screamed from the angle. She stayed, holding James Edward Morrison's hand, whispering to him about Iowa cornfields she'd never seen, about his mother who would receive a telegram that would destroy her, about how brave he'd been. She stayed until his hand went slack in hers, until his chest stopped rising, until those fever-bright eyes went dim and fixed on something beyond the stained canvas ceiling. Then Margaret Sullivan stood on shaking legs, straightened her apron, and walked to bed 48, because there were always more beds, always more boys, always more hands that needed holding. But something had shifted that morning in July. Something that would change everything, because Margaret didn't know it yet. But James Edward Morrison was different. His death would matter in ways she couldn't imagine, and the promise she'd made to tell his mother he wasn't scared would lead her on a journey that would reveal the true cost of war, the meaning of sacrifice, and the terrible, beautiful weight of a single human touch. Margaret wrote the letter that night by flashlight in her tent, exhausted hands struggling to form neat words. She'd promised. The military would send the official telegram, cold and efficient. The Secretary of War desires to express his deep regret. But Margaret had promised something more. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," she began. The paper was damp from the humidity, the ink bleeding slightly at the edges. She told Sarah Morrison of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, that her son had not been alone, that he'd been brave, that his last words had been of her. Margaret didn't mention the morphine shortage, the way James had bitten through his lip to keep from screaming, the smell of gangrene that had started 2 days before he died. Some truths were meant to be carried by those who witnessed them, not those who loved. She sealed the letter and added it to the canvas bag where she kept her personal effects. The bag also contained 43 other envelopes, letters she'd written to mothers, fathers, wives, sweethearts, letters describing final moments, last words, the dignity of deaths that had contained no dignity at all. She sent them in batches when supply trucks made the return journey to England. It was against regulation. Nurses were supposed to maintain professional detachment, but Margaret had stopped caring about regulations somewhere around bed number 20. 3 weeks later, the field hospital moved closer to the front as Allied forces pushed deeper into France. They set up near a town called Argentan, in an abandoned schoolhouse that still smelled of chalk and children. The building had taken artillery damage. Half the roof was gone, replaced by tarps that turned the operating theater into an oven during the day and leaked during the frequent summer storms. Margaret fell into the rhythm of war medicine. Triage at dawn when the ambulances arrived. Surgery until her hands shook too badly to hold instruments. Rounds through the recovery ward. Sleep in stolen hours. And always, always the dying. She held more hands. Added more letters to her collection. Bed 61. Thomas Chen from San Francisco, who sang something in Chinese before his heart stopped. Bed 75. Robert Jackson from Alabama, who apologized for bleeding on her apron. Bed 82. Michael O'Brien from Boston, who made her promise to light a candle in a church. Any church for his daughter he'd never met. Then, in September, a letter arrived for her. Margaret almost didn't recognize her own name on the envelope. Mail was rare, usually weeks or months delayed, but the handwriting was careful, elegant despite a visible tremor in the pen strokes. The return address read, Mrs. Sarah Morrison, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Margaret sat on her cot in the nurse's tent, the letter in her trembling hands. Around her, off-duty nurses slept the dead sleep of exhaustion. Outside, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. She opened the envelope carefully, afraid it might contain anger, blame, questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she found grace. Dear Miss Sullivan, your letter reached me in August. I cannot adequately express what your words meant to me, to my family, to everyone who loved James. The War Department sent their telegram. I'm sure you know the one. The same words sent to thousands of mothers. But your letter gave me back my son. You were there. You held his hand. You heard his voice. You saw him not as a soldier or a casualty number, but as James, as my boy. You don't know what that means. Perhaps you cannot know, unless you have held your child as an infant and must now imagine him dying on foreign soil among strangers. Except, he wasn't among strangers. He was with you. The letter continued for 3 pages. Sarah Morrison wrote about James's childhood, his dreams of becoming a teacher, his fear when the draft notice came. She wrote about the last letter she'd received from him. Cheerful, lying, pretending war was an adventure. She wrote about standing in her kitchen when the telegram arrived, how the world had gone silent and gray. But your letter brought color back, Sarah wrote near the end. You gave me the gift of knowing he was not alone, that someone held his hand, that someone cared enough to remember his name and write to his mother. I cannot repay such a kindness, but I can honor it, and I can tell you this. What you are doing matters more than you may ever know. Margaret read the letter 3 times before she carefully folded it and placed it in her bag, next to the growing collection of letters waiting to be sent. Her hands were shaking. Her vision was blurred. She hadn't cried since Normandy, since the early days when tears still felt appropriate. But she cried now, silently into her pillow while the artillery thunder grew closer and the wounded kept coming. The next morning, she returned to the ward. Bed 93 needed morphine. Bed 97 needed his dressing changed. Bed 102 needed surgery, he wouldn't survive. And bed 105, a young man named David from Pennsylvania, needed someone to hold his hand. Margaret knelt beside him, took his burning hand in hers, and made another promise to another mother she would likely never meet. Because Sarah Morrison was right. It mattered. Every moment mattered. Every hand, every promise, every letter. In the machinery of war that turned young men into casualties and casualties into statistics, Margaret Sullivan had found her purpose: to remember, to witness, to ensure that no one died alone or forgotten. But she didn't know yet that Sarah Morrison's letter was only the beginning, that other letters would follow, that she was creating something that would ripple far beyond her understanding, that the promise she'd made to one dying soldier would eventually force her to confront the most difficult question of all. How many promises can one person keep before the weight of them breaks her? Winter came to Europe like a punishment. By December 1944, Margaret's field hospital had moved to Belgium, where the Battle of the Bulge filled their beds faster than they could empty them. The wounded arrived in waves, frostbitten and bleeding, shocked by the sudden German counteroffensive. The schoolhouse had been replaced by a requisitioned factory building with broken windows and no heating. Snow blew through the gaps. The nurses worked in their coats. Margaret's collection of letters had grown to 137. She kept them in a metal ammunition box now. Her canvas bag had fallen apart. The box sat under her cot, heavy with promises and grief. She still wrote to every family, still described deaths with carefully crafted dignity, but something was changing inside her, something fracturing beneath the surface. It started with the dreams. She'd expected nightmares. All the nurses had them, but Margaret's dreams were different. She dreamed of hands, hundreds of them, reaching up from darkness, all grasping for hers. In the dreams, she couldn't reach them all. She tried, stretching her arms until her shoulders separated, until her fingers bled. But there were always more hands than she could hold. She woke gasping, her own hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. Dr. Patterson noticed first. He found her one morning in the supply closet, sitting on the floor, staring at her hands. Nurse Sullivan? She looked up. Patterson was 53, a surgeon from Philadelphia who'd volunteered despite his age. He'd seen her hold dying men's hands. He'd never commented on it before. "How many have you held?" he asked quietly. 143. The number came automatically. She always knew the number. "That's too many, Margaret." She laughed, a sound without humor. "Should I have let them die alone? Should I have kept professional distance while boys called for their mothers?" Patterson crouched beside her, his knees cracking. "I'm not criticizing. I'm worried. You're taking on weight that's going to crush you. Someone has to carry it, not alone. Not all of it." But Patterson didn't understand. The letters that arrived for her, and they came regularly now, 10 or 15 a month, weren't just gratitude. They were connections. Threads linking her to families she'd never meet, to lives she'd touched in the most intimate moment possible. Sarah Morrison had started something. She'd shared Margaret's information with other mothers from Cedar Rapids, and those mothers had connected with mothers from other towns. A network had formed, invisible but real, of families who'd lost sons to this war and found comfort in Margaret's letters. In January 1945, Margaret received a package. Inside was a photograph. Sarah Morrison standing beside James's grave in a military cemetery in Iowa. The grave was covered in flowers. Behind Sarah stood a crowd, 30 or 40 people, all holding photographs of their own. The note read, "They all heard about your letter. They all wanted to thank you. You've given us a way to grieve together, to know our boys mattered. Several have said they wish they could have someone like you write to them. I know that's not possible, but I wanted you to see what you've given us." Margaret stared at the photograph until her vision blurred. 30 or 40 families, and she'd only written to Sarah. How many more families were out there, desperate for any detail about their sons' final moments? How many mothers stood beside graves, trying to imagine what their boys had experienced, whether they'd suffered, whether they'd been alone? That night, Margaret started a new letter. Not to a family of someone who died, but to Dr. Patterson's suggestion for a military chaplain he knew, proposing an idea. What if there was a formal system? What if every nurse who attended the dying received training and support to write letters? What if families could request information and receive honest, compassionate answers about those final moments? She worked on the proposal for weeks, writing and rewriting between shifts. But even as she wrote, the hands kept coming. Bed 167. Anthony Russo from New York, who made her promise to tell his wife the baby would be beautiful. Bed 179. William Hayes from Texas, who sang half a hymn before his voice failed. Bed 191. Charles Peterson from Minnesota, whose last word was "Mama," said so softly Margaret almost missed it. Each death, each promise, each letter added to the weight. Margaret stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night. She lost 15 pounds she didn't have to lose. Her hands shook constantly now, not just from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something breaking. In March, another letter arrived, but this one was different. "Dear Nurse Sullivan, you don't know me. My name is Helen Kowalski. My son, Private Robert Kowalski, died in Italy in 1943. I never received any details about his death except the official telegram. I've spent 2 years wondering if he suffered, if he was alone, if he called for me. I heard about you from Sarah Morrison. She shared your letter about James. I know it's too late for my Robert. You weren't there, you never knew him. But I'm writing to ask if you might know who was there, if there are records, if there's any way to find out what his last moments were like. I know this is impossible. I know I'm asking for something that can't be given, but I have to try. A mother has to try." Margaret read the letter 3 times and felt something inside her finally break. Because Helen Kowalski was right, it was impossible. There were no records of who held whose hand. Most soldiers died alone or surrounded by strangers who were too busy trying to save the next one to remember the last one's name. Most families would never know. Most mothers would spend the rest of their lives wondering, imagining, grieving without closure. And Margaret couldn't help them. Couldn't hold all the hands. Couldn't write all the letters. Couldn't carry all the grief. She sat on her cot, Helen Kowalski's letter in her shaking hands, and understood for the first time that her promise to James Morrison, to tell his mother he wasn't scared, had been a lie. Not because James had been scared, but because the promise implied something that wasn't true, that comfort was possible, that meaning could be made from this horror, that one person's witness could somehow redeem the waste and brutality of young men dying in mud and snow and terror. Margaret Sullivan, who had held 193 hands and written 193 letters and kept 193 promises, finally understood the unbearable truth. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The ammunition box became Margaret's confessional. Late at night, when the ward was quiet except for groaning and morphine-induced sleep, she would open it and read the letters. Not the ones she'd written. Those were long gone, carried across oceans to grieving families, but the ones that had come back to her. Responses from mothers, fathers, wives, brothers. Thank you. You gave us peace. We can finally say goodbye. By April 1945, the box held 217 letters of gratitude. Margaret had held 239 hands. The numbers no longer balanced. 12 families had written without ever receiving a letter from her. Friends of Sarah Morrison. Mothers who'd heard stories and hoped desperately that someone, somewhere, had witnessed their sons' deaths with the same compassion. She couldn't help them, and it was destroying her. Dr. Patterson found her in the factory building's ruins one morning, sitting among rubble from a wall that had partially collapsed during a recent artillery barrage. She was holding the ammunition box on her lap, tears streaming silently down her face. Margaret. His voice was gentle. You need to stop. I can't. You're going to break. I'm already broken. She looked up at him, and Patterson saw something in her eyes that frightened him. A hollowness. An absence. Do you know what I realized, Doctor? Every hand I held, every promise I made, it was selfish. That's not true. It is. I did it to make myself feel better. To give myself purpose. To pretend that witness means something. That being there matters. That... Her voice cracked. That any of this has meaning. Patterson sat beside her in the rubble. Around them, the factory building groaned with structural damage. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Germany was collapsing. Another few weeks, maybe a month, but Margaret looked like she wouldn't survive to see it. I received a letter yesterday, she said quietly, opening the box. From a mother in California. Her son died at Guadalcanal in 1942. She's been writing to chaplains, to commanding officers, to anyone she can find, asking if anyone was with him at the end, asking if he said anything, asking if he was brave. You can't answer that. No. But I wrote back anyway. I told her... Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled out a carbon copy of her response. I told her that someone was surely there, that no Marine dies alone, that her son's last thoughts were certainly of her. I lied, Dr. Patterson. I wrote her a beautiful, comforting lie. Maybe that's what she needed. Maybe it's what I needed. Margaret closed the box, to pretend I could help, to pretend any of us can help, to pretend that holding James Morrison's hand mattered when there are hundreds of thousands of James Morrisons, and most of them died alone, and most of their mothers will never know. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of ambulances, a convoy of them, filled with casualties from the Rhine crossing. Margaret stood mechanically, brushed dust from her uniform, and returned to work. But Patterson watched her throughout that day and saw someone going through motions without presence, a nurse performing her duties with technical precision but spiritual absence. That night, Margaret did something she'd never done before. She walked past a dying soldier without stopping to hold his hand. The soldier was bed 242. His name was George. She'd seen it on his chart, but hadn't looked at his face, hadn't let herself see him as a person. He was just another casualty, another body, another statistic. When he whispered please, the same word James Morrison had whispered 9 months and a lifetime ago, Margaret kept walking. She made it to her tent before she vomited. Then she sat on her cot, shaking, while the part of her that had survived 9 months of holding dying men's hands finally, completely shattered. Dr. Patterson found her there an hour later. She was holding a bottle of morphine, one of the small vials they used for the wounded. She wasn't trying to inject it. She was just holding it, staring at it, contemplating the escape it offered. Give me that. Patterson's voice was sharp, commanding. When she didn't respond, he took it from her hands. Then he sat beside her and said words that would change everything. You're going home. I'm recommending immediate evacuation for psychological trauma. No. The word came automatically. I can't leave. Who will hold their hands? Other nurses. Who will write the letters? The chaplain. Who will carry the grief? Everyone and no one. Margaret, you have to let go. I promised. You're one person. You can't keep promises to everyone. You can't save anyone. All you can do is witness. And witnessing has a cost. And you've paid more than anyone should have to pay. Margaret looked at him with empty eyes. What about George? Who? Bed 242. I walked past him. He needed someone and I walked past. Patterson was quiet for a moment. I'll check on him. He did. When he returned, his face told Margaret everything she needed to know. George had died 20 minutes ago, alone, like most of them, like so many of them. You couldn't have saved him, Patterson said. I could have been there, and if you'd been there, if you'd held his hand and made another promise and added another letter to your box, would it have made any difference? Would it have changed the fact that he's dead? That this war is a meat grinder? That we're all just trying to pretend there's meaning in the meaningless? The words hung in the air between them. Patterson looked shocked at his own honesty. They were both too exhausted for pretense. I'm sending you home, he repeated. That's an order. Margaret didn't argue. She couldn't, because Patterson was right. She was broken. And the terrible truth was that George's death, the fact that she'd walked past him, had been almost a relief. One less hand to hold, one less promise to keep, one less letter to add to the box, one less piece of herself to give away. Margaret Sullivan arrived at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland on May 10, 1945. Germany had surrendered 3 days earlier. The war in Europe was over. She'd missed it. Medically evacuated 2 weeks before the end. Sent home like a broken piece of equipment that could no longer perform its function. The military processed her quietly. Battle fatigue, they called it. Though she'd never been in battle. Psychological trauma. Nervous exhaustion. They gave her an honorable discharge, a small pension, and the address of a Veterans Administration hospital in Baltimore, where she could receive treatment. She never went. Instead, she took a bus to Iowa, to Cedar Rapids, to an address she'd memorized from an envelope 9 months ago, 1847 Oak Street, Sarah Morrison's home. Margaret stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes before she could make herself approach the front door. The house was modest, white clapboard with blue shutters, a porch with a swing. Normal, peaceful, impossible. When Sarah Morrison opened the door and saw Margaret standing there, gaunt, haunted, carrying an ammunition box, she understood immediately. She'd been a mother long enough to recognize breaking when she saw it. "You're her," Sarah said softly. "The nurse." Margaret nodded. Speech felt impossible. "Come in, please." The inside of the house was shrine and prison both. Photographs of James everywhere, baby pictures, school portraits, him in his uniform, smiling, young, alive. Margaret felt her breath catch. She'd held this boy's hand while he died, but she'd never really seen him. Not like this. Not whole and laughing and real. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm so sorry." Sarah guided her to the couch, sat beside her, waited while Margaret's breathing steadied. The ammunition box sat between them like a coffin. "Why are you here?" Sarah asked. Not unkindly, genuinely curious, Margaret opened the box. Inside were 217 letters from families, dozens of photographs, and one envelope she'd never sent. She pulled out the unsent letter, the last one she'd written, to George's family. The soldier she'd walked past? "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. I think I needed to tell you the truth." "What truth?" "That I lied. In my letter about James, when I said he wasn't scared, he was terrified. When I said he went peacefully, he was in agony. When I said he spoke of you with love, he could barely speak at all. I made it beautiful because I needed it to be beautiful. Because if his death had meaning, then maybe all of it had meaning. But it didn't. It doesn't. He died in a tent that smelled like death, in pain, scared, and nothing I did changed that." Margaret expected anger, accusations. What she got was Sarah Morrison's hand covering hers. "I know," Sarah said quietly. Margaret looked up. "Shocked, I'm a mother. I know what war is. I know what death is. Did you think your letter fooled me? Did you think I didn't understand that you were giving me a gift? Not truth, but compassion. Not facts, but grace? But I lied, you witnessed. That's different." Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand. "You think I wanted to know that my baby suffered? You think any mother wants that truth? What you gave me wasn't a lie. It was mercy. You held his hand. You were there. That's what mattered. Not the words you wrote afterward." Margaret felt something break inside her chest again, but differently this time. not shattering, cracking open. I walked past one at the end. His name was George. He needed someone and I just couldn't anymore. How many hands did you hold before George? 239. Sarah Morrison's eyes widened. 239 boys didn't die alone because of you. 239 families received letters that gave them peace. And you're tormenting yourself over the one you couldn't reach? He died alone. Most of them die alone. That's war. That's death. You can't hold every hand. You're one person. One exhausted, traumatized, broken person who gave everything she had until there was nothing left to give. Sarah stood, walked to a shelf, and returned with an envelope. Read this. It was a letter addressed to Sarah Morrison, from Helen Kowalski, the mother who'd written to Margaret asking about her son who died in Italy. Dear Mrs. Morrison, you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for sharing Nurse Sullivan's address. I wrote to her, knowing she couldn't help me, but hoping. She wrote back. She couldn't tell me about my Robert. She was never there. But she told me something more important. She told me that someone holds the hands of those who can be reached, and that has to be enough. She told me that wondering is part of loving, and that my questions honor Robert's memory more than answers ever could. She gave me permission to not know, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. Margaret read the letter twice. I don't remember writing that. You probably wrote it during one of your worst days, running on nothing but will and compassion you didn't think you had left. And it saved her, just like your letter saved me, just like all those letters saved all those families. It wasn't enough. It was everything. Sarah sat back down, took both of Margaret's hands. Let me tell you what you really did. You created a bridge between the living and the dead. You gave meaning to meaningless deaths, not because the deaths themselves had meaning, but because you witnessed them. You proved that even in the worst of human horror, there are still humans who care enough to hold hands and remember names and make promises. They'll spend the rest of their lives trying to keep. I broke my promise to George. You kept your promise to 239 others. That's not failure. That's heroism. Margaret closed her eyes. Tears streamed down her face. Real tears, not the numb crying that had accompanied her collapse, but genuine grief and relief mixed into something almost like healing. What do I do now? She whispered. You rest, you heal. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, you keep witnessing. Maybe not hands, maybe not dying soldiers, but the world still needs people who see each other, who remember names, who prove that compassion exists even when everything else fails. Margaret stayed in Cedar Rapids for 3 months. Sarah Morrison gave her James's old room, fed her, sat with her during nightmares, and slowly, carefully, helped her understand that breaking wasn't the same as broken. That survivors carried scars. That witness came with a cost, but also with a responsibility to keep living, to keep remembering. In August, when Japan surrendered and the war finally, truly ended, Margaret opened the ammunition box one last time. She read every letter, every thank you, every expression of gratitude from families who'd found peace in her words. Then she closed it and put it in Sarah Morrison's attic. I can't carry it anymore, she told Sarah. I'll keep it safe. For when you're ready. Margaret never retrieved it, but she did keep witnessing. She became a nurse again, working in a Veterans Administration hospital in Chicago. She held hands of old soldiers dying decades after their wars ended. She listened to stories. She remembered names, and once a year on the anniversary of James Morrison's death, she returned to Cedar Rapids. She stood beside his grave, beside hundreds of graves of boys who'd died too young, and she spoke their names aloud. All 239 of them that she could remember. Because Sarah Morrison was right. Witness was a bridge. Compassion was proof that humanity survived even in hell. And holding one hand, writing one letter, keeping one promise, it might not save everyone, but it saved someone. And someone was enough. James Edward Morrison died in France in July 1944. Margaret Sullivan held his hand as he took his final breath. That moment changed both their lives, one that ended, one that continued carrying the weight of those final seconds forever. If this story touched you, if you've ever known the cost of witness or the weight of compassion, share your thoughts in the comments below. And consider subscribing, because every story remembered is a promise kept, and every voice added to the conversation proves that we still see each other, even in darkness. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering.